Liebe Zuschauerinnen, liebe Zuschauer, herzlich willkommen zurück beim Deutschen Wirtschaftsforum. Mein Name ist Marc Schiffauer, ich begrüße Sie hier aus Frankfurt. Wir kommen von der Wirtschaft zur Politik, genauer gesagt zur Demokratie in unserer nächsten Runde. Ich fange an mit einer Suggestivfrage. Können Sie sich vorstellen, dass nächstes Jahr, wenn wir den Bundestag wählen, wir die Polizei vor Wahllokale schicken müssen, um sicherzustellen, dass die Stimmen richtig ausgezählt werden? Und können Sie sich dazu noch vorstellen, dass das Staatsoberhaupt aufgerufen hat, die Stimmen nicht mehr auszuzählen? Wenn Sie denken, das ist Fiktion, nein, das ist zum Teil Realität, und zwar in den USA. In Michigan und in Arizona schützen Polizisten Wahllokale. Wir wollen nicht alarmistisch sein, aber wir wollen auch nicht verharmlosen. Wenn Sie denken, Amerika ist weit weg, das hat mit europäischen Verhältnissen nichts zu tun, dann möchte ich Ihnen noch einen Gedanken von John Kornblum mit auf den Weg geben, der heute Mittag um 13 Uhr bei uns in der Transatlantikrunde im Gespräch war. John Kornblum sagte sinngemäß Folgendes: Viele der Tendenzen, die wir in den USA sehen, Extremismus, Populismus, gespaltene Gesellschaft und die Erosion der demokratischen Institutionen, werden wir auch in Europa sehen und sehen es schon zum Teil. Is this how democracy looks like? Ist also das Thema unserer nächsten Runde. Und wir haben uns einen tollen, spannenden Gast eingeladen. Daniel Ziblatt. So spricht man seinen Namen richtig aus, hoffe ich zumindest, auch wenn er sich sehr deutsch anhört und auch bestens Deutsch kann. Daniel Ziblatt ist einer der gefragtesten US-amerikanischen Politikwissenschaftler zum Thema Democracy. Er ist Eaton Professor of Science and Government an der Harvard University, und Professor Jutta Almendinger, die gestern hier schon zu Gast war, hat ihn gewinnen können für das Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin als Direktor der Forschungsabteilung Transformation der Demokratie. Außerdem ist er Future Fellow des neu gegründeten Thinktanks The New Institute, das Erk-Rickmers in Hamburg gegründet hat. Und er hat 2018 einen Bestseller geschrieben, der auf der New York Times Liste war, mit Stephen Levitsky zusammen, How Democracies Die. Wie Demokratien sterben, darüber wird er jetzt reden. Und zwar mit meinem Kollegen Manuel Hartung. Manuel Hartung ist Ressortleiter des Ressorts Wissen bei der Zeit, ist jetzt in Hamburg mir zugeschaltet, und er ist auch wie ich, Transatlantiker. Er hat in Harvard studiert und kennt sich bestens aus in den USA, aber auch in Deutschland. Ich wünsche Ihnen viel Vergnügen mit unserer Runde zu How Democracies Die, beziehungsweise am besten nicht sterben. Over to you, lieber Manuel, und viel Vergnügen.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank, lieber Marc Schiffauer. Schöne Grüße nach Frankfurt, hier aus Hamburg, aus dem Helmut-Schmidt-Haus, wo wir einige der Sessions in unseren Konversationen hier beim digitalen Wirtschaftsforum übertragen. Ich freue mich sehr, mit Daniel Ziblatt diskutieren zu können. Ich freue mich aber auch sehr, mit Ihnen diskutieren zu können, meine Damen und Herren, denn Ihre Fragen, Ihre Anregungen, Ihre Anmerkungen an Daniel Ziblatt werden wir auch stellen, versuchen hier in die Diskussion zu integrieren. Sie sehen das bei Slido oder im Chat, wenn Sie dort Ihre Fragen stellen, schreiben Sie da rein. Wir werden versuchen, die in diese Diskussion einzubauen. Und nun würde ich auf Englisch wechseln, weil wir diese Konversation auf Englisch führen werden. So, a warm welcome to you, Daniel, in Newton, Massachusetts, a state that voted to 80% for Joe Biden, if I recall that correctly. So, you're a professor at Harvard University, and I received an email from Harvard this morning of the Harvard Gazette. This is one of Harvard's newspapers. And they sent out an email with a title, with a headline, Feeling Election Stress, ? Harvard psychologists offer tips to survive political stress and strain. So Daniel, if we replace Harvard psychologists by a Harvard political scientist, what is your recommendation in these days? How to deal with political stress and strain?
Yeah, very good. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. And I really look forward to hearing questions and hearing your questions as well. Yeah, very good question. I mean, I think we all feel stress and strain, and people aren't sleeping very much because they stay up all night watching the election returns. What I would like to say, though, I guess my main point would be that one needs to understand the phenomena if one wants to kind of not be frightened of the phenomena. And I think one thing that is really important to think about is that a majority of Americans have never supported Donald Trump in 2016 nor in 2020. Donald Trump never had a majority of approval over the last 4 years. And so I think actually it turns out most Americans are quite liberal minded, quite open, and one looks at opinion surveys on Black Lives Matter. Most Americans, white Americans, are sympathetic to Black Lives Matter. So I think so in some ways I trust the people. And so that's a reassuring thought for me, I guess, in this moment. And so the question is how to get our institutions right to reflect what the people really want.
Mm. So yeah, let me add a personal question first. How did you deal with this situation? You haven't slept much, did you tell me? But how were the last 48 hours for you? What did you do?
Well, so I've been watching the news, and since we're all isolated at home, I don't get out much. But I'm in sort of various WhatsApp groups and texting with people that I trust, whose opinions I trust, bouncing ideas off of them. So I have about 3 or 4 different circles of friends and colleagues who we're constantly texting, responding to events as a way of forming my own opinion. I mean, this is sort of how I operate in a way. And so with colleagues, my co-author, Steve Levitsky, we're in constant contact, maybe 20 hours a day. As we hear the news, what do we think is happening, following Twitter and trying not to overreact. I mean, one of the things I think that's really important is that chaos is the best friend of authoritarians. And so I think it's really important not to overreact to the moment. And I think, things actually have gone much smoother than a lot of people have expected. And so, so in any case, I think, getting the opinion and feedback of colleagues and friends from a diverse range of opinions also. I mean, I intentionally kind of reach out to people who are in different sectors of the economy and different sectors of politics, just to kind of hear what people are thinking, get a sense of what people are thinking. And in general, I do think people are surprised, at least the people I talk to are surprised at how relatively peaceful things have gone. And so that's been reassuring as well.
Mm. So you expected it to be less peaceful than we see today. But please explain to us, if you trust in the American people, so why are so many people voting for Donald Trump? This is a puzzle to many people on this side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle to me too. I mean, I think it's a puzzle to a lot of people. And I think this is one of the big questions that comes out of this experience, is because I think many people expected that there would be a real repudiation of Trumpism and Donald Trump. There's been such a, from my view, failure of basic governance in terms of our democracy, in terms of the response to COVID, in terms of the response to economic crisis. So after all of this, 67 million Americans still voted for Donald Trump. So how do we understand this? And I think this is the task for social science, at least, I think, going forward, is to really understanding this. And so, I mean, you mentioned that I'm at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, and that's one of the topics that I'm interested in investigating there, because, it's a lot of it is geographically concentrated. And so it's in specific locations of a country where there's lots of support. And so this kind of geographic polarization is really important. So as a first kind of answer to the question, I think in the American context, what's really important to understand is how polarized our society is. I mean, a lot of people vote for Donald Trump because he's the Republican candidate. I mean, two things. One often says in American society, there's this saying that the most segregated day in America is on Sunday. And what this is a reference to is that blacks and whites go to different churches on Sunday. I think a remarkable thing happened on election day. There wasn't one election on Tuesday. There was 2 elections. There was the election that Republicans participated in, which was often in person. And then there was the election that Democrats participated in, which was by mail and ahead of time, because of this possible. And the reason that the Republicans went to vote on election day in the polling stations is because they tend to be less afraid of COVID. They're also less likely to wear masks. Democrats are afraid of COVID, voted by mail. Democrats also wear masks. So in this kind of moment where in a country, usually everybody has this common experience of voting. In fact, we have these 2 very different experiences. And I think what that's an indicator of is the degree to which we're polarized. And so I think part of the explanation for why people vote for Donald Trump is that he's the Republican nominee, and Republican, and what polarization means in my mind is not only disagreeing on tax rates and healthcare policy and these kinds of issues. It's when one regards one's rivals as enemies. And I think there's increasing sense on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, that one is so fearful of the other side that one will go to extreme measures to prevent the other side from gaining power. And so I think this high level of partisan identity, what political scientists call partisan motivated reasoning, where they reach their conclusion and then backtrack in a kind of illogical way, in a sense, to their positions on issues. And this is why people are willing to overlook I think what I regard as democratic abuses of Donald Trump. And just, there's actually good social scientific research showing this as well. That a political scientist at Yale University has done these surveys where he shows that on both the left and the right, in the United States, he also has done this survey in Venezuela and other countries, that one's more willing to overlook abuses, democratic abuses on one's own side of the aisle if you fear the other partisan side. And so I think that's a little bit what's happening right now.
So you described the different voting habits, like the in-person vote, mostly chosen by the Republican supporters, and the mail-in vote and the absentee vote by Democratic supporters, which is one of the reasons why it's so complicated to get to a final result. And the final now in those days, in these hours, is so nail-biting. So a couple of days ago, when you had a video conversation with Georg Dietz from the New Institute, you were like somehow optimistic in the end that Joe Biden will be the winner of the election. So what is your prognosis now at this point of time, at this afternoon in 3:30 German Middle European time?
Well, on my screen, I have a Twitter feed up, and I'm waiting to see if there's any other news. But I mean, I don't think... At this point, I am still optimistic that Joe Biden will win. I mean, if I had to bet right now, I think Joe Biden will become the nominee. What made me particularly, I think there was an opportunity, which I think it appears will not come to pass, to have a clean sweep. So in other words, have Democrats retake the Senate as well as the House of Representatives and the presidency. And had that happened, I think there would have been room for all sorts of institutional reforms. But because that's not likely to happen, because it looks like the Republicans will retain control of the Senate and the Democrats will take the presidency, the good news is, I think that, I think by electing Joe Biden, this puts a halt to the damage that Donald Trump can do to our political system. The bad news is these 67 million voters who voted for Donald Trump are continue to probably be somewhat loyal to Donald Trump. And our institutions will be beset by gridlock. I mean, I think that's what the future looks like. So in some ways, I'm much less optimistic today than I was a week ago.
So let me integrate the first question we got via Slido. Thank you very much for the person who is asking. So the question is, why did the polls before the election again not reflect the results, again after it happened in 2016? It's a question which is truly puzzling to me as well. So what's your explanation on that? And thank you very much to the person who asked for participating in our discussion, and you're encouraged to do so further on.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I'm not somebody who does polling. I'm a consumer, not a producer of polling. So, I'm not expert on exactly what went wrong, but this is a reoccurring issue. I mean, it seems as if polling is a kind of broken science. I mean, there seems to be something that's repeatedly gone wrong. And, a couple of possible explanations is that, the two general kinds of explanations are, one, that the sampling procedures that are being used are just off. And there's some way in which, perhaps because of polarization, in fact, Republicans who want to vote for Trump are less likely to respond, first of all, to respond to survey questions at all, and B, when they do respond, to mislead the questioners. And so there's this kind of effect where people are embarrassed because of polarization to say that they want to vote for Donald Trump. So I think that's possible. So there's some kind of, and in principle, one could adjust for these things, but it's sort of after the damage has been done, this industry is losing credibility, I think. So that's one possibility. There's also a second possibility, which is that the sampling is fine, but one of the interesting things is that it assumes the predictive power of polling assumes perfectly free and fair elections. In other words, that the sample that you have in your survey reflects what the electorate really looks like. And so another concern would be, if there's systematic biases in the electoral system, either in people's ability to turn out to vote. And so, everybody here, I'm sure, has seen the pictures of people waiting in line to vote, which is in effect a way of dissuading people from voting. So somebody may respond to a survey, but then not be in line for so long they give up and don't vote, or see the lines and don't go out to vote. So that's another possibility, that there's some way in which the disconnect between polling and the actual election outcomes tells us something that is wrong with our elections, as much as something is wrong with the polling. One counter argument to that last position is that we had more turnout in this election than at any point as a percentage of the electorate than any point since 1900. So this is a remarkably high turnout event. So although I think there has been systematic efforts to suppress the vote, this has triggered a kind of mass mobilization. So in any case, it's not clear. I mean, the people who do this work claim that at the national level, their results are actually pretty accurate. Part of the issue is that, they're trying to estimate at the state level, and because of our electoral college system, you get these kinds of distortions. And so, they underestimate what happened in Miami, but that's a very small place. But overall, nationally, they kind of basically got it right.
So the very high turnout, you mentioned that. So is that a sign for the general strength of American democracy that so many people participated in that election?
Yeah, I think generally, I would say yes. I mean, the higher the turnout, the better. I think I'm a Democrat, so I believe the more people vote, the better. What it does also indicate, of course, is a high degree of polarization. I mean, people voted, a lot of Democrats voted because they're afraid of Donald Trump. And a lot of people voted for Donald Trump because they're so fearful of Democrats, as I said before. And so polarization, I really regard this concept of polarization as a double-edged sword in a way, because on the one hand, we need polarization in a democracy because that's what democracy is about, is about heated arguments, disagreements, good political fights over issues, and one side wins. The problem is that extreme polarization is very dangerous for democracy. And so I think what we're witnessing today is high polarization, which means a lot of people turn out to vote, but there's also this other underside to this.
So your book, How Democracies Die, Wie Demokratien sterben, so heißt es auf Deutsch. So it was a book which struck me when I read this back in 2018. And the first sentence of the book, the first sentence of the first chapter in the introduction is our democracy in danger? It is a question we never thought we'd be asking. This is the first sentence Stephen Levitsky and you are writing in that book. So if you think back into the situation when you wrote the book on the dangers of democracy, and compare that to your prognoses, to your evaluation today. So is it even more in danger? And why did this radically change or increase the danger of democracy in the past 2 years? What are the main factors for that development?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, I think when we wrote this book, we were criticized by some people as being overly alarmist. Yeah. And, that you showed the black cover of the book and it seemed like we're trying to scare people and so on. But I think in retrospect, we weren't alarmist enough. And I think in many ways we had thought that what would have happened over the course of the 4 years of the Trump presidency was that the Republican Party would have, which suffered in some sense a kind of hostile takeover or supported Trump's nomination to the presidency in a very reluctant way, at least to begin with, the Republican Party, when facing abuses of the rule of law, of democratic norms, democratic institutions, would have spoken up and would have drawn a hard line and said, we can't support this. We kept waiting for that to happen. That never happened. So I think a really critical guardrail, in a sense, of our democracy, which are the mainstream political parties, failed. And so this was shocking. And some people maybe expected this all along, but I think part of the reason we wrote this book was it was intended for Republican audiences, in part to try to convince them of the stakes and the scale and the nature of the threat. And so that has not happened, and that still to this date has not happened. And so that's why I think the abuses have happened, the Republican Party's allowed this to happen. Republican senators, Republican leading politicians, and so this is what we've seen. So that's one of the things. I guess the second point is the level of polarization, which we already expected. I think at some level that's already been there, and we sort of always knew that was there. And so that hasn't gotten better. I would say, if anything, perhaps gotten worse. And so the one point I will say, though, is, given the current results of this election, I mean, I feel slightly better because I think this was really the last. This is, and I shouldn't use the past tense, this election is really a critical threshold. And so it's absolutely critical, I think, for, not even speaking from partisan terms, but as a social scientist interested in democracy, for Joe Biden to win the election. And so I think that this makes me slightly more optimistic, but still I remain very alarmed about the future state, because I think what we're going to see going forward in the last chapter of our book, well, maybe I'll stop there because we can talk about the future, I guess.
So in your book, you argue that the resilience of institutions, of democratic institutions, is utterly important for the persistence of democracy. So if you see like the last days attacks of Donald Trump concerning those institutions, like the people who count votes, for example, so what's your perspective on the stability of the democratic institution after so much damage has been done in past years in the US?
Yeah, so his latest announcements, in some ways, I mean, it's shocking. It continues to be shocking, but it's more of the same. The phrase that people often use is shocking, but not surprising. So a lot of damage has been done. The thing that elected autocrats do when you look around the world is they carry out a sort of playbook, as we've described it, and using a football metaphor, they go after the neutral referees of the state. So whether that's judicial institutions, rule of law institutions, the coercive apparatus of the state, police institutions, and they try to capture those institutions to use as shields to defend against themselves, investigations, so on. And they also use it as a weapon to go after their enemies. And Donald Trump's attempted to do this. I think we have quite robust institutions. And so the Justice Department, there's a lot of Justice Department officials who remain independent civil servants and so on. But nonetheless, he's fired FBI director, he's fired inspectors general, who are these kind of neutral officials who are assigned to each ministry to make sure that no violations are taking place. He's fired them and replaced them with his own figures. And so there's been a kind of hollowing out of the state. And so that's going to require lots of rebuilding. So that's one area where the damage is serious and significant and possibly enduring. A second area is what an elected autocrat often does is tries to tilt the playing field by changing the rules of the game. So in particular, changing the electoral rules of the game. And so the one example that we refer in our book is Erdogan, or actually Viktor Orban in Hungary, changing the electoral rules so that it makes it easier for him to gain supermajorities in the parliament while not gaining supermajorities of the vote. So I would argue that the Trump presidency has damaged our electoral institutions by his repeated accusations of election fraud, which are not based in any fact, has changed public opinion. And so vast majorities of Republicans expected before the election that there would be massive election fraud in this election and continue to think our elections are rigged, in their favorite phrase. When you have large segments of the electorate who basically think the electoral system, the elections, which are the heart of democracy, are corrupt and unfair, it's hard to maintain a democracy. And so even if President Trump leaves office, you now have public opinion has shifted. And so this, in a sense, changes the rules of the game, I would say. So those are the two areas I think where the most damage has been done. And I guess a final third one I would mention is just his constant attacks on the media and calling the media the enemy of the people and so on, has also, if one looks at opinion survey, there's already been negative views of the media, but it appears as if Republicans have a much more negative view of the media and think that there's a vast conspiracy to take down President Trump. And again, free media, elections, these are kind of pillars of democracy. And if you have large segments of the electorate, majorities of one party thinking that these institutions are basically entirely corrupt, it's hard to maintain a democracy with that.
Mm-hmm. So let us zoom out a little and try to compare the situation in the US to the situation of democracies in Europe. So you already mentioned Hungary, but if you look at Germany and the stability of democracy in Germany, what is your take there? So where should we aware of? What are like signals you'd be conscious of as a German Democrat?
Yeah, so I heard the reference to Ambassador Kornblum's warning for Germany from the United States, and I mean I share that concern. I'm a great admirer of the Bundesrepublik's democratic institutions and the post-war constitution and political parties and its great historic achievement. So I think overall, and I think this is actually visible also in the response to COVID, as critical as Germans are of their own government and the response to COVID and the debates about it, I think it's clear that the German response has been much more effective, legitimate, generated support for the incumbent rather than the opposite. And so this suggests, I think, kind of a basic trust in institutions. And again, that's maybe hard for German audiences to kind of believe, but when you compare it to the United States, I think it's clear that it's operating in very different worlds. So I think the response to COVID suggests a resilient democracy. I think German democracy is quite resilient. And what makes it resilient are its political parties, its institutions and norms of negotiation, let's say, within the Bundesrat, and the fact that the chancellor gets together with the minister presidents of the states and tries to formulate a kind of common response through these federal institutions, as well as citizens who are vigilant and worried when they see threats to democracy. So all of these things are, I think, before I point out the warnings, I just want to highlight some of the things that I think are the strengths of German democracy. All of that said, I mean, certainly that these same forces of radical right, and I don't even really think populism is the right term. I would say kind of radical right illiberalism, the endorsement of violence by fringe groups, the kind of attacks on ethnic minorities, all of these elements that are in German society over the last several years are obviously very worrying. I think two things that maybe give me the most concern about German democracy at the current moment is the degree to which there is a kind of radical right infiltration of the coercive apparatus, namely police institutions. This is something that is, from the outside looking in, makes me a little bit nervous. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed head on, because, one of the key things that's come out of the debates in the US over, when Black Lives Matters are in the street and police violence, I mean, I think this is something that needs to really be taken seriously, because, the state apparatus has to be neutral. It's a neutral referee. And so in particular, police institutions are absolutely critical. And so that's one area. And I also think that the rise of course, radical right political parties, and in particular, the rise of the AfD has thrown the political system into turmoil in a way. And so even if the AfD itself has kind of diminished in recent months, the amount of kind of chaos in a way within the parliament itself and within the political system that this actor has brought to bear is a real challenge, because, in a way, the post-war system was premised on the existence of a set of political parties who all played by the same rules. And if an outsider party comes along that no longer plays by the rules, the question is how to respond to that, and I think, we have, in a sense, had a slightly different experience because of our majoritarian system. The outsider took over one of the main parties. The threat in Germany, of course, is the emergence of a political party that takes support away from the mainstream parties. And so the question of how to respond to that seems to me to be one of the main questions that German Democrats need to figure out, because on the one hand, you don't want to overreact, because this also enhances polarization, exaggerates polarization. But on the other hand, there needs to be an incredible vigilance against this and an unwillingness to form coalitions and so on. So striking that balance is something that's very tricky, and I hope Germans can learn from other countries and kind of solve to address this basic challenge.
And I'm curious what how you monitor, how you observe that while you move back and forth between Boston, Berlin, and Hamburg. Let me, to the final round of that discussion, let me just add a question on polarization in universities. So given the fact that the WISSEN section, the section Science of die Zeit, will also cover universities. So I'm interested in the role of universities related to that polarization. So Harvard University is a beacon of liberal thought, a very liberal institution. And this March, the student newspaper, the Harvard Crimson, conducted a survey among Harvard faculty members, and 38.4% defined themselves as very liberal, 41.3% as liberal, and only 1.5% defined them as conservative or very conservative. So what's the role of universities concerning polarization in the US?
Yeah, that's a pretty homogeneous ideology that you've just described there. You wouldn't know it by the amount of the political fights that take place on the campus over lots of other issues. But no, it's true that I think that homogeneity makes Harvard a target of, and other universities and institutions a target of groups who kind of regard this as a kind of location of cultural power in our political system. And there's this kind of interesting dynamic where I think conservatives, liberals in the United States think conservatives have disproportionate power in the political system. And conservatives think that liberals have disproportionate power in cultural institutions. And so this is kind of exactly the kind of statistic that people bring up. I think as a scientist, like ideology, I try not to let it affect my assessment of things very much. And I have conservative colleagues. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to allow for free speech on our campuses and to allow for speakers to come. And this is always becomes an increasingly contentious issue when conservative speakers come to campus. Sometimes there's pressure that they ought not be allowed to come onto campus. And in general, I think that, we have to, the spirit of free inquiry requires free speech. Intense disagreement. And so given that situation that you just described, I think there has to be a special commitment to kind of engage those outside of the university by bringing people in, but also by speaking outwards. And so that's part of the reason I wrote this book that you showed at the beginning, is to speak to a broader audience. And, I go around giving talks to all sorts of groups, and I'm happy to be invited by conservatives as well as liberal institutions, and to talk to as many people as possible. And so as a academic, as a professor, as a teacher, it's important for me to do that, to hear all sides. And so, that's the role of a professor. I think it's hard to, I'm not quite sure what to make. I'm not sure if I guess in some ways hidden behind your question is a kind of maybe a suggestion, or I'm hearing it, that maybe these campuses should be more diverse ideologically. And I'm not sure, how that gets done, or B, if that's necessarily desirable or a goal. I mean, it's desirable, but is that a goal that policy should be targeted for? Should we be recruiting students and faculty based on their ideology? That strikes me as really not very smart. So in a sense, what we're seeing in this kind of statistic is the polarization. We're a symptom of a deeper cause. I think that's maybe the way to think about it.
So last question. There is a unique feature of US universities, which is the revolving door between academia and politics. So leading professors join government, join the administration for like 2 years and do a project on whatever, or even become ministers or administrative secretaries. And especially Harvard has a tradition like that, named Joseph Nye or Samantha Power, who joined the administrations. So if a possible future President Biden would offer you the post of the leader of a unit to overcome polarization in a society, so A, would you accept that? And B, what would you do in that period of time? So what would be your first steps to assume to do in that position?
So I'll answer the second question, not necessarily the first. Since I've just accepted a position at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, they wouldn't be happy to hear I'm, jumping ship to join the Biden administration. I mean, that's not really, my thing. But I think the question is a good one, especially the second part of the question is a good one. What can be done? And there's a big movement afoot, I would say. Not just me, but many other people. Who recognize that part of the, and I think this may take a minute to explain here, because I think it's really important, that in the United States, we essentially have a system of minority rule at present, in the sense that majority, Republicans have controlled the presidency for 12 of the last 20 years, and they've only won the majority in the popular vote one time. So we have, the Electoral College, the U.S. Senate, which overrepresents rural areas. This is a feature of our constitutional structure that's always been there, that rural areas are overrepresented. Small states are overrepresented. But for the first time in the recent years, because rural areas tend to be supporting conservatives, or that there's a perfect correlation nearly now between population density and party, this means that Republicans are systematically overrepresented. And so what this means is we have a system in which the majority doesn't govern. So I think given this, what we need in order to prevent really a kind of entrenched system of minority rule, which becomes harder and harder to undo, what we really need to do is introduce a set of reforms in our democracy to allow the majorities to govern. So this might mean abolishing the Electoral College. This means adding new states to the U.S. Senate. There's a long tradition of this in the United States. Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico. This means passing new voting laws at the national level to guarantee automatic voter registration, something that happens in Germany, increasing the number of polling stations so we don't have these voting lines. All of these things are critical to allow majorities to govern. And just a final point about this is that not only would this make our system more democratic, I think this would have the effect of de-radicalizing the Republican Party. Because as it currently is, the Republican Party is able to win power without winning majorities. And the only way that political parties change is when they lose. Just like businesses, if they don't have any customers, they have to change what they sell. The Republican Party hasn't, although it doesn't win majorities in the electorate, hasn't had to change because it continues to have power because of these crutches, in a sense, the support of this odd constitutional system. So I think by reforming our system, we could actually it could lead to a de-radicalization of the Republican Party over the medium term, as well as a depolarization of our society. So this is what I would push for.
Yeah, thank you very much for laying out this program for electoral reform. It was a fascinating conversation, Daniel. So thank you very much for your time in this dense period of time in history. Please join me in thanking Daniel Ziblatt in Newton, Massachusetts. Thank you for joining us here at Deutsches Wirtschaftsforum Digital. And we'll continue this conversation and Marc Schiffer will explain what will be next, a conversation between Constanze Stelzenmüller and Andreas Heuchler. And thank you very much again for your thoughts, for your insight. And we're very much looking forward to continue this conversation on this side of the Atlantic once you're in Berlin and in Hamburg. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you. Cheers.